Social Emotional Character Development Strategic Plan. During the 2017-18 school year, the Behavior Leadership Team will begin the implementation of a 3-year strategic plan to address social, emotional, character development within the district. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an overview. This presentation is for the board's information.
Welcome.
Thank you. Well, good evening, President Rohde, Vice President Arnold, Superintendent Thompson. We're excited tonight to kind of share our 3-year plan, and the PowerPoint will be on the screen as well. As we look at, first I want to say thank you to all our behavior leadership team members listed below for their work to really help define what it looks like for our 3-year plan, specifically around the social emotional character development as we go through. This is a 3-year plan. Obviously, the best plans are the best when we can implement well. So we definitely want to make sure that year 1, our implementation is going in. A lot of it is going to be about awareness going into year 2 and 3, so we can continue to provide the results and help our students become successful. This was all tied in with the state standard of social emotional character development as well as the Rose capacity. And if you see specifically around Rose capacity number 4, sufficient self-knowledge and knowledge of his or her mental and physical wellness. This in particular really speaks to the idea of employability skills, specifically around self-management and self-awareness. So how do we, as our group, we've talked about how does this look and what can we do to help promote the idea of employability skills that our state talks about within their definition of a college and career ready student. So self-management, self-awareness was really an area that we really looked at as we went through. And I'm giving you kind of an overview before we get into the meat of it. Transparency in data, we really wanted to make sure that we had that transparency and looking at the data that we want to look at to make sure that we're following our improvement cycle of Plan, Do, Check, Act to make sure that things are going well. Do we need to tweak as we go through our plan as well? So this is a working document. As we work through year 1, if there's things that we need to change, we can obviously do that within year 2 and 3 as well. So this transparency, we're obviously a large urban district, and specifically we can't really look at our data, cannot be comparable to other suburban districts. We made a conscious decision to track all the data, ask schools to report all behavior incidents. So you'll see that within our plan to make sure that if there are ever any incidents that we are tracking that. And we did that so we can better make decisions that will positively impact our students. We have to know where we are in order to know where we want to go and to meet our goals, was specifically what we really talked about as a team. So other districts may not, they may only report certain requirements or certain data, but we're going to make sure that we capture it all. So some of the data collection and improvement cycles you see on the screen, incident referrals on Synergy. The whole idea is to decrease variability within our big system. We want to make sure we are aligned together towards a purpose to help our students behaviorally and academically. And we know that behavior affects academics as well as academics affects behavior. So as we continue to work this plan, we know that we're going to see growth in both areas specifically. Chronic absenteeism, tardies to schools, and even our Safe and Civil Schools Climate and Safety Survey will be data that we will collect and look at to make sure that we are heading in the right direction. Obviously, our state looks at graduation rate, and we want to make sure that we are increasing our graduation rate. And we have specifics around our JAG. We have a JAG program that helps certain at-risk students that may be short on credits that help promote a class to get them on track to be either post-secondary opportunities as well as workforce ready, so providing the skills to be successful. We also have Ready to Impact is also another area that we'll be looking at that helps our students as well, specific ones that really need a little extra push and guidance for them to be successful. And then obviously our individual plans of study. Our individual plans of study is going to be huge when we look at data for our students. So we're going to start implementation this year with those individual plans of studies, which is going to help with those soft skills necessary for success. As you look at the Kansas, we've seen the MTSS framework, so you see this triangle. Obviously, the green is for all. That's our Tier 1, and then our yellow is some for Tier 2, and then few for Tier 3. as we specifically look at the 3 different areas of academic, which is the reading and math that we spent some time on. Behavioral is the PBIS, and the PBIS is going to be extremely important, the positive behavior interventions and support. This is a program that helps improve our student behaviors. This starts with foundations work with safe and civil schools. And then we also have some validated curricula that we want to use all the way from pre-K all the way through secondary as well. So right now, elementary, that curricula is the second step, which is going to help provide that character development that is necessary for success for our students. So Tier 1, our goal, we want great instruction, quality instruction, being proactive, school-wide systems for all students, staff, and settings. Then when we get to the Tier 2, our goal is to increase supports, remediation, small groups to address any risks so we can get them back on track. And then our last is Tier 3, will be for few students. The goal is intensive supports, reverse deficits, individualized to address any high risk of those students. The social emotional character development also fits perfectly with this framework of MTSS within those 2 areas down below of behavioral and social. So you can see how that will also be tied in the secondary of the individual plans of study. So here is, as we get deeper into what this plan looks like, there's going to be 4 areas, 4 components of social emotional character development within our plan. You have the social emotional character development in the middle, and then you see the 4 components of MTSS foundations, social emotional learning, trauma, specifically trauma awareness, and cultural competencies that we're actually going to speak to those 4 areas. So specifically, first one is the MTSS foundations. This is the safe and civil work, the safe and civil schools foundations. What we want to do is make sure that everybody understands the modules. They may not have completely finished. We have new principals, we have new staff members that may not have received all the different modules, so we want to make sure everybody's on the same page. That's the idea of decreasing that variability amongst our big system. So we want to make sure that everybody has that. So we'll be working through, schools will be having a self-assessment, a rubric to look at to really say, okay, where is it that we may have stopped, but we want to continue to move forward with it to make sure all modules and components are necessary within their schools. So they're taking a self-assessment, and we're going to differentiate their professional learning to make sure that we get through those modules from Module A, starting with the foundations of support, all the way down through Module F, which is the continuum of behavior support.
We'll just reach around. Well, the modules, did we bump there? The modules allow buildings to build capacity to work with their students and serve students behaviorally and academically. But the modules, importantly, are oriented so that we share responsibility for behavior across our district. So it's not we blame the parents, we blame the kid, we blame the principal, we blame the teacher. It's we all share equal responsibility and collaborative problem solving. That we're in this together, and we do want to be transparent about the data and what does the data tell us as we begin to use the cycle of improvement that is the basic structure of safe and civil schools. Module F is important because most of the modules prior to that is what are we doing school-wide, what are we doing in groups in a prevention model to prevent kids needing Tier 2 and Tier 3. So we all know that the MTSS is designed, especially in an urban district where there's lots of needs. If we're unable to meet Tier 1, we'll be flooded in our lifeboats with Tier 3. So it's so important that we accept responsibility to do the work up front, the heavy lifting, so that we are able to work with the intense needs that we have, but with the limited resources and staff that we have. So we're looking at Module F this year, which is the integrated continuum, which is more designed for Tier 2 and Tier 3, where we begin to deliver more targeted or individual supports for students rather than large groups as we would through the other modules. So part of our plan is we're going to have 4 trainings designed for developing more intense supports for Tier 2 and Tier 3 students. All the buildings will bring in teams made up of school psychologists, counselors, social workers, lead teachers, principals, and work during that time is how do we develop evidence-based practices to take back to our building to implement with integrity so that when we do look at our data, kids have had interventions that are meaningful and allows students to benefit from those interventions. You'll see on the board agenda tonight those trainings, for those 4 trainings, as well as the materials for those trainings. If you look at the names of these, they're a little bit descriptive of what they are. Tough Kid Bundle, On Task in a Box, Meaningful Work, and Connection. So just briefly, if we can answer questions about this, but it pretty much says what it is. When you have a tough kid, and a tough kid can make a teacher's life miserable because they may not comply with teachers' directives. So when we see temper tantrums and kicking and biting and hitting, many times those are secondary behaviors as a result of a request that a teacher has made. So the student, in a coercive way, wants the teacher to either not enforce that request or let me get out of this work, or let me get out of I want to talk with my friends, I don't want, So when they give that request, a student who's difficult in this Tough Kid Bundle would be anywhere around 40 to 50% of the time they would respond to a teacher's request. So that can make a long day. If you look at a typical kid, most typical kids are going to follow a teacher's request at least 90% of the time. They're going to be on task at least 80-some% of the time. So when we look at kids who have difficulties in classes, they have behavioral excesses and they have behavioral or social-emotional deficits. And so when we talk about those excesses and deficits, those are what set children on the path for dropout. So if you have behavioral excesses and you are unable to limit your behavior, then you're going to be in conflict with the school rules and be punished for those types of behaviors. So that's when we start to alienate children, when we see them in those continual cycles of punishment. So these programs take a different approach, and they began to use a positive approach because many of our kids have been punished, and Michelle will go into some of the trauma that they have. And so some of our kids, punishment doesn't work, and we have to come back and say, maybe this was harsh, but harsher may not get us where we want to go. So looking at these programs, we can go more into this, but they begin to connect with adults. We know that one of the important things about kids continuing towards graduation is having caring adults in their life. And so many of these programs are designed, they're not magic, but they are evidence-based, which begin to have adults spend time with students and giving them feedback and teaching them behaviors that are more appropriate in those situations.
Would you guys like to have questions now or wait till the end?
Anytime.
Joy?
Hi. I wondered if you could talk a little bit. We've been doing safe and civil school work in our school district for about 8 years now. So since we do have it on the agenda tonight, can you talk a little bit about how this is different than what we've been doing, or additional, or why this, why now?
If you look at the overall comprehensive approach to safe and civil schools, it was a concept of how you look at children and work with them in a respectful way and teach them behaviors. And so the Stoic model is very effective. What we also found, though, was that the training that districts have, in other words, the professional development, the limited amount of time to make things stick is very difficult. So you get some brief training, you go back to the building. If you don't have a leadership team that takes that work and begins to get traction and keep it in front of the faculty, it starts to lose its momentum. What we believe about the new modules is you don't have to take them in the chronological order that they are. If you do your rubric and you say, well, we really feel like we need to concentrate more on behavior conflicts, bullying, those types of behaviors, you can go to Module D and E and begin to look at those in context to your data and your building. So these modules really allow buildings to reach a consensus with their faculty. Where are we at? What's our priorities? Where do we want to all get behind and be consistent with how we interact in our expectations? As Randy's always said, don't pick dress code if only half the faculty is going to support it. You're just going to frustrate the other half and frustrate the kids. So it really is consistency in that Stoic model. But I believe that these modules allow buildings the opportunity to build the capacity in their building at their rate. And that's, you hear the saying, do MTSS to do MTSS. Not all our buildings are going to be in the same place. And so this differentiation, you can go to different buildings. You'll have an inviting culture in one. You can walk into a building, you can feel it. You go into another building, they don't have that. So how do you begin to analyze where you're at to build that sense of kids belong here, we respect kids, we value kids, we want them in school, we want to add to the quality of their lives. So it takes 3 to 5 years in the best circumstances to ingrain and institutionalize these type of cultures. We have some buildings that we could say these are embedded. It's their work. The principal can leave and they can go on. We have other places where we didn't get that traction. And what we need to do, instead of saying we're getting on another boat with another idea, is let's use these behavioral principles that are the same. You can go look at the PBIS structure, George Sagai, Randy Sprick, Safe and Civil Schools. They all have the same basic principles of behavior. And it's really having the staff collectively share beliefs in how those beliefs are going to drive their actions. But many times it takes people taking action to say, well, you know, I did try this positive interaction with kids and build relationships, and it's working. But it's hard to get people to take action until their beliefs are there. But you have to take action. You kind of have to reserve judgment and say, okay, let's reserve judgment. Let's try this to see, you know, if it works or not.
Miss, I want to just add a little bit. The difference, the question that you asked was, what's the difference between what we've done in the past and what we're currently, we're proposing that we do for now. The difference is that if you notice, we are talking about Tier 2 and Tier 3 students. The work that we've done in the past has been all around the work of Tier 1 students. And if you look on your MTSS rubric, it'll tell you that the majority of our kids, when we're talking about the kids that Dr. Guthrie is talking about, we're not talking about the majority of our kids. We're talking about a small portion of students that sit in the Tier 2 and the Tier 3 area. And so that's the difference, is that we're now focusing in on Tier 2 and Tier 3 students. We're looking at different work than what we've done in the past. The Safe and Civil School work has different layers within it. And so we're taking a deeper dive with some of that, because we know that most of our kids will respond to Tier 1, and the work that we've done, most of our kids responded to that. But we do have a portion of students that what we were doing was not working. And so we have to now think outside of the box and look deeper into what else is there available in the work that we've already currently done. So we're going to stay with Safe and Civil, and we're going to dig in the Tier 2 and Tier 3 materials and all of the wonderful things that they have available there. But as you continue to listen, what you'll see is we know that as we look at what they have available for Tier 2 and Tier 3, we know that there will be other kids that won't fit in that particular area as well. So as you keep listening, you'll kind of hear a whole wraparound of what will be happening for the students, so that we try not to ever miss another student as we are working with them in their behavior work. So right now we're talking about Tier 2 and Tier 3, another layer, and as we move forward, we'll dig a little bit deeper so that we can ensure that we have layers of support and a continuum of services for all of our kids around behavior.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. And I think it explains why on this slide we're talking about training psychologists, counselors, social workers, administrators. We're talking about the child study teams, the people who often are trying to figure out how to help teachers deal with Tier 2 and Tier 3, and helping them develop those skills as well, so that they can then help teachers with those issues in their classroom. Because last year we talked about, and it was, I think, different people sitting here, so welcome to the team too, but we talked a lot about what we ask our teachers to deal with behavior-wise and trauma. I know you'll probably talk about that soon, but what we ask our students to deal with in a classroom in a day, and how much support have we given them. So I appreciate that, and I will listen to the rest, but that helps me understand why Tier 2, Tier 3. Good, thank you.
And one of the other interventions that you'll see in the executive summary is a program called First Step Next. And as you hear from teachers talk, especially kindergarten teachers, if you look at our behavioral data, we have seen increases in difficulty for kids transitioning into school and being able to be ready to learn. As you know, the State Department is using that as one of their metrics is kindergarten readiness and ready to learn. So the first step next is going to be at several of our buildings, and it's pre-K through first grade. It goes through second grade. We're going to focus on pre-K through first grade. And the whole purpose of that program is explicit teaching of students' behavior so that they'll be able to benefit from school. If we don't do it early, it's just as important in reading. If you'll have the academic deficits, behavior will cause. You'll have the social deficits so that kids, won't have friends and they'll tend to bully others because they'll work with younger kids. So you have the social deficits. And then you also have the self-management deficits. So those deficits are worked with this first step next so that kids are able to have more self-management, more self-regulation, being able to relate and share with friends and do the things that we know that you should learn in kindergarten to move forward. So that's going to be an interesting program. We're really looking at that to kind of meet that gap that we have when we're inundated with kindergartners who aren't able to benefit from their schooling at such a young age. Just to put the social emotional learning in the context, if you kind of look at this diagram, and you think of a student kind of being here in the center of the diagram, you've got about 5 social competencies that we and the state have laid forward for students to benefit so they can move into those individual plans of study and go into the workforce. So if you look at that in context, we've got our self-awareness, our self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. So students will acquire that through the feedback and nurturing of staff. They get that in their classrooms and their school-wide practices and policies from our Safe and Civil. They'll get it through our second step social emotional curriculum. But sometimes, as Dr. Thompson said, that's not enough. In other words, we'll still have kids who fall out into Tier 3 with intense needs. And how do we, it's always said that it takes a community for graduating high school students. So we wanted to take a look at how could we partner with our community and use resources and supports for these wraparound services. We would be here quite some time if we listed every partnership that we had, because we've just done a great job of inviting partners into our community schools and inviting them to participate and add value to our schools. But just wanted to briefly share some of the important ones. The juvenile justice system has recently had their legislative statutes rewritten, and they have a different way that they're working with schools and working with children and parents who go into the juvenile justice system. So our memorandums of understanding, and we meet with cross teams and we look at how do we help juvenile justice and how do they help us in working with kids. Wichita Police Department is done a great job of training their officers to have officers that understand mental illness and crisis, so that when they arrive on the scene, they're able to understand a student who may have autism, who is in a mental state of confusion and that. So, having people who understand and have the same mission of helping within the community. ComCare, as you know, is our community resource for mental health. We're partnering with them. Family Consultation Services, because of financial reasons, was unable to continue to put mental health therapists in our buildings. We had quite a few. We got up to about 28. ComCare stepped up and is going to fill that void along with the Mental Health Association. So we're real pleased. We want to continue to add value by having more mental health workers in our buildings. Grace Med wants to continue with that. So we really feel we've got some opportunities to have on-site mental health support, wraparound services for families that are in crisis. We all know that when you look at foster care, and many times foster beds aren't available and kids move in and out and they go to other locales until the bed comes available. And we know how difficult that is on children to be upset and moved and change locations in school. So we're partnering with them to see what can we do together to make this a more predictable and consistent basis for the kids that come into our schools. And as well as, the work that United Way's done with our chronic absenteeism. So I really feel good that we've reached out and they've reciprocated with the, strong, let's get in there, let's roll up our sleeves and help our schools. So I really think we want to continue to develop our partnerships because there's a vast support out there. We just have to step up and say, let's do it together.
I'm going to take you through the next two pieces of our SECD plan, and they really do tie together. The first being trauma, and trauma has kind of become a buzzword, and we don't want it to just be a buzzword for us, so we're taking the time to really dive in and understand what trauma is. We have so many of our kiddos that come to us every day living in that perpetual chronic stress, and that's really the definition of trauma. And unfortunately for those kiddos, trauma and that perpetual stress affects the way the brain develops. And so those are some of the things that we are trying to learn about and have the strategies to have an implementation and help kids. We're doing that on kind of a two-prong approach. The first is, and I believe I discussed this with you a few weeks ago when I was able to visit with you, about what we're doing with our administrators. And we're doing a book study to move from being trauma-informed, simply understanding what trauma is, to moving hopefully through this plan, and we know it's going to take a few years to do that, to becoming trauma-aware, so that everybody who has contact with our kiddos every day really understands what trauma is, how kids react to trauma in a lot of different ways, and having the strategies then to help kids with that. So that's the first prong approach. The second is some work that we're going to do based on data. We've mentioned before that we have that MTSS rubric that schools are doing, and it's going to kind of give us an idea of where they are in the process of those safe and civil foundations work. And we'll use that as a piece of data. And then we're also going to look at some of our historical data with our schools and work with principals and teachers. We have to have our teachers ready for this work, and we know we have schools that are really ready to do that. And so we will be trying to do some small, because we know we have to go slow to go fast, but in a few of our schools using the NME model, which is the neurosequential model for education. And then our friends at the State Department have also given us some great information, and it's called the Wisconsin model. The state of Wisconsin has developed their own model for working with trauma in schools. So we're going to dive into that, really look at that, and decide what's going to be best in this first year and in the next few years for our elementary schools. All of this then ties into the next piece of that, this plan, which is the culturally diverse competencies. And, I've talked to you before about knowing the kids that are in front of you, and that's really what this is. It's understanding the specific culture, language, and socioeconomic nuances of our families and our kids that are in front of us. And being able to do that not only shapes our beliefs and our actions, but our instructional strategies and how we plan and how we implement lessons for our kids. So those two kind of roll into the next slide that we have here. We borrowed from our friends at TASN and the State Department. And I apologize, I should have put the link up here for you guys to have later, but I will be happy to send that to you for the adverse childhood experiences. It's not really, it's kind of a questionnaire, I guess you would call it. We know that through some research that there are, I think, about 10 questions that you can ask, and those deal with trauma. And depending on the number of traumatic events, stressful events you've had in your life, there are some outcomes, some health issues and some outcomes. And we know that we're going to have some of our staff members who have a high ACEs score, and so we need to work on some self-care with them. And we know that our kids are going to come to us with those scores too. So having that knowledge of the ACEs score is kind of just is a measure of the traumatic events that you've had in your life. If you see the percentages over on the side, it kind of shows you, and if we think about the MTSS model again, the green is all. So all of our kids, this is from state data, would have about 45% of our kids who've had an ACE experience in their life. And that's our universal piece. And so understanding that trauma and having some things in place that help kids develop some resiliency to some of the things that happens in their life is going to be important at that tier 1 piece. For example, our second step. Okay? As you move into tier 2, we are going to have 33% of our kids, almost 34%, that have an elevated risk more ACEs in their lives. And so we have we know that the state is saying you need to develop some group level activities with them. And that's kind of what Neil was talking about, and having some of our strategic partners, our outside agencies, come in and help with that. And then unfortunately, we're going to have 21% of our kiddos who have that really elevated risk of trauma and a very high ACEs score. And some of those kiddos may have those individual plans that we will be working on. And across the bottom, then, is that cultural competency piece. So all through that, no matter what level, what tier you are in ACEs, we know that we have to understand your culture, your socioeconomic level, and again, that's that piece of who's sitting in front of us and how do we reach them. So all of that then rolls into our 3 plans. And that I was just talking about with the ACEs scores, kind of the kid view. Now we're switching to the school view. So for our schools, if you think of this as our schools, we have tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 for our schools, all, some, and few. So all of our schools will have some behavior intervention training. We've discussed before about how we will, in the elementary ranks, be keeping our data electronically through Synergy. There will be no more paper pencil, which is good. That will really give us more accurate data. Doing that book study, that trauma awareness piece with our leaders, and then the SEL curriculum, the second step. So all of our schools will get that. Some of our schools will get that differentiated professional development. Some people are on track and ready to go. Others will go back and differentiate their professional learning. And that was based on that MTSS rubric that I've talked to you about before and Gil mentioned earlier. And then again, looking at those Synergy incident reports to decide who are those schools that we really need to target with some different specific strategies, And then finally, our tier 3, we have a handful of schools that are working specifically on those diverse competencies, that biography-driven instruction. And they will also have a small number of schools that will do some of that trauma-informed work as we try to decide how we can roll this out to everybody and have it be successful. And then you will see through year 2018 and through 2019 school year, it's really just the same items. We'll just continue to refine and make them better and gather data and make adjustments. And the same goes for the following school year, 2019 to 2020. Again, just refining the work that we're doing and making sure that we're doing the right things right for our kids. And finally, then, you can see how this, again, just kind of all rolls back into one, using that MTSS framework to make a positive impact for our kids.
We have one more question. Betty?
Thank you, Mike, and actually, it's more a comment. I am so pleased for this presentation because each board meeting, when we read the work of the Wichita Public School, is to empower all. And when you look at the fact that we are talking about over half of our students, when we total tier 2 and 3 together, that represents over half of our students. And the fact that we are looking at those variables that impact learning is significant. I mean, that says a lot because we cannot empower all until we understand that there are a lot of variables that impact learning. And, you know, we are looking at so many different avenues, and for this district to be so forward-thinking and looking at the needs of all of our students, how we can make all of them successful. So I am very, very pleased with your presentation, and I thank you so much for the information.
Lynn Rogers?
Thank you, too. I appreciate this. I guess I want to put this in perspective. You know, this is not a problem just of Wichita Public Schools. It's not a problem just of public schools. It's not a problem just of schools. This is a community crisis, our mental health issues in this county, in this state. We've had millions of dollars cut, and I visited recently with our sheriff, and you know, one whole pod of our jail is mental health patients or inmates and detainees, and that's huge. And I guess what he and I talked about was that when adults deal with mental health issues, kids bring those to school every morning. And so we have to deal with them. And so I'm glad we're doing that. I really appreciate that. I was also encouraged, the law enforcement, the hospitals, many of the folks, they're going to do a mental health summit at the end of the month. And so I asked them, I said, can we bring schools in? Can I bring Alicia? Can we, you know, it was meant for legislators, but, and it really isn't meant necessarily for education, but I said, we've got to be part of the conversation because we're working on it and doing things. And so people need to understand it. And it's not always an economic issue. Some of the trauma issues are, but you know, these are issues that are happening in you know, private school populations, you know, the suburban population. So again, I just want to make sure we put it in perspective so people understand it's a bigger issue. It's outside of the school, but it comes to school each and every day. Thank you.
Cheryl Logan?
Yes, I just want to make sure that I'm clear on, because I was tracking with you very well with the Tier 2 and Tier 3 with the students. And then the last few slides, you moved that to the schools. And so I want to make sure that, that I am with you. Because we're really implementing the training and so on that we're doing, the 4 trainings this year. Those are all meant for students in Tier 2 and Tier 3 with child study teams, correct?
Right, which would be for, which, I guess I was remiss in not having that in there. That would be for all schools. So that's the green piece.
Right.
If you think about, this is kind of the triangle laid out. All of our schools will get that, yes. All of our
And
child
it's all
study
for our
teams.
child study teams at every school?
Correct.
Okay,
yes.
but when you jumped to the schools and in tiers, we have, or they have, or somebody has decided some schools are 1, some are 2, and some are 3?
Right.
And
that-
you're going to be working with them differently?
Yes. For example, if you look over in the Tier 3 schools, and it's not necessarily that they're Tier 3 schools, it's just the idea that there will be few schools in this group of work.
Okay.
So if we're thinking about using the Wisconsin model to roll that out to buildings for the teachers to learn about those trauma strategies within their classrooms, that won't be something that will be district-wide in year 1. That will be just for a few schools. So that's what puts them in that Tier 3, because there are only a handful of schools that will be doing that work, and that will be based on the data that we're able to collect.
So it's not, or is it, based on the data from their buildings of they have more kids that
Yes.
may need assistance at Tier 3?
Correct, yes.
Okay, so it's not necessarily good, bad, and ugly. It is simply being able to support the kids in their buildings in a different kind of way.
Absolutely, yes.
In the state, through ESSA and through the way that the money's distributed to our schools, they've identified barriers that are in our communities that impact our schools. And so they've rated those factors. What are the largest factor that interferes? And so they picked the top 4 or 5 factors that say when these barriers exist at a high degree, schools struggle to be successful. So if we look at cumulative poverty, that's the highest variable. But the other factors then become disruptive behavior, chronic absenteeism, student mobility, and students who have high ESOL populations that have language barriers they have to overcome as well. When those factors are present in high numbers, they need more supports. And so this is the way that we can begin to look at how do we bring those intensive supports to help buildings add value to these barriers to prevent them from, shaping the kids so that outcomes are different.
So will those buildings receive different kinds of training, more intensive training?
It will be both.
Okay.
It will be a lot more intensive with those strategies specific to the cultural piece and the trauma piece. And it will be different from those schools who would be sort of the opposite of what Dr. Guthrie just explained. And that would be based again on the data that we have for the needs of the kids within each building.
Okay, but all of these schools would still receive the training that the child study team, et cetera, are
Absolutely,
getting.
yes.
So we're still dealing with the all population with
Everybody
Tier
get-
2 and 3.
yes.
We're just adding a little bit more if they have enough need within their building that they need it.
Right, exactly.
Thank you,
Yes,
it clarifies.
sorry.
Thank you very
Sorry.
much. Great presentation. I'm so glad to see us begin to address our Tier 2 and 3 kids in a different kind of way. Thanks.
Joy?
I wonder if you could back up to the slide that had the percentage of Kansas adverse childhood experiences. So I just want to revisit this slide and make sure that I understand it. Because what I think this slide is saying is that in a 20-child classroom in our district, at least 11 children on average would have had a tier 2 or the yellow or the red number of adverse experiences. So I can imagine that there might be people in our community that would look at that and say, that seems awfully high. Could you help us? I'm not disputing that. I'm not saying it is. I just could see that there are people asking. So obvious traumas that come to my mind are things like abuse. Senator Rogers talked about mental health issues in the home, substance abuse. Right. Those are obvious kinds of things. But what other kinds of things might fit into those categories that people might not think that would then raise the bar?
And some of those, and I apologize again for not having that for you, but it kind of breaks abuse out and neglect into some different areas. If you have seen or witnessed a parent batter, another parent or a child, violence, neglect, there's a differentiation between physical and verbal abuse, substance abuse, absolutely. Having a family member that's been incarcerated is another one. So there are 10 different, kind of breaks it out into 10 different areas to look at. And the more ACEs you have, the more susceptible you are to some behaviors and health issues. And so that's when you get into that red zone. 21% of our kids have had multiple ACEs that they would report or that families would report. And so we know that then that means we have more kids that we need to be able to reach that maybe we wouldn't be if we weren't informed and aware of trauma.
And I want to kind of make this very clear to those who are listening. This is a state document.
I was going to ask you,
it is a state document.
Is this across the entire state?
It is.
So this
That is
isn't,
correct.
as Senator Rogers said, but just to really clarify, so we're saying across the state of Kansas, in any 20-child classroom, we can have as many as 11 children who are in the yellow and the red, 4 in the red and 6 or 7 in the yellow, in any classroom of 20 kids, if they were an average classroom.
This is definitely average data from the state.
Right.
In fact, we got that from TASN, and they're noted on the slide. So this is them taking their numbers, their historical numbers that have been reported to them, and making this graphic to try to explain the need for schools to become trauma aware and trauma informed.
One that you may want to, that would maybe make you feel a little bit different about this chart, let's think about divorce. Divorce could be
So divorce is in this list,
yes.
okay.
Yes. So when you think about these numbers, it's not something where, it's not all groom and, everything, many things could be trauma for a
Right.
student.
And I guess that's what I was
yeah.
trying to make sure I understood. Like, it's not just about children being beaten or seeing
No,
somebody
not
being
at all.
beaten. It's also things like divorce or
Yes.
separation in their family.
Not
is
knowing where
correct.
you're going to
Someone
Or
who's
can it
a
be
grandparent that
losing
passes
somebody?
away.
Okay.
Those things
Yes.
are on the
Thank you.
list that also contributes to that. So again, it doesn't matter whether you are high economic or low or, any of those types of things. Anything that could happen to a child that would cause them to be, kind of throw them off a little bit may throw them into one of these categories.
Okay, so really, some of them, as adults, we would think of them as major stressors, but for a child, because of their development and where they are in their life, they become a trauma. So, a divorce is a major stress in a couple or in a family, but adults would handle that differently, and it wouldn't impact their development because they're adults and they're making those choices, whereas in the children's life, that's a trauma, and, okay.
Yeah, and
I got
I think
that.
another way to think of that too is your stressor may not be the same as my stressor. And so it's not the same for kids either. So, and you may have a great resiliency and I don't.
Right.
So there are so many factors that play into that. It's really not about the event. It's about the accumulation of the chronic stress for a child.
And the grit or resiliency
Yeah,
that,
exactly.
and so how do we help students have more resiliency and build in that grit, because then
Yes.
they do better. There's a
Yes.
really great TED Talk on grit. I'm sure you've all seen it. We should just get together and watch it because it's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Barb Fuller.
Thank you. I am going to ask my questions quickly from page 2. In the first one, data not comparable to suburban districts. I understand that. And if we're looking at Kansas in general, we are doing that even if they aren't in Wichita Public Schools and they're getting something similar. Would that be a conclusion that I've made all by myself? Yes.
Can you repeat that? Because I'm trying to get an understanding of what you're asking.
I'm just, well, it says here, data not comparable to suburban districts. So I am, in my mind, looking much different at a suburban district than I'm looking at a Wichita Public School District. And I know we do good things in the Wichita Public Schools, and we're very focused on these kids getting the help that we have. So
Absolutely.
I'm dealing with this in my head.
Yeah, absolutely. The comparable too is all about what people actually report as well. So some may just be the requirements of the state versus for us, we made a conscious decision to count all incidences so we can make sure that we know where we're at and where we want to go.
Good.
So it could be just the comparing, obviously with the differences that we have in our district, but it's also the specific incidences that we are going to hold ourselves accountable to make sure that we're reporting, to make sure that we know what tiered or what supports we need to put into place.
And you'll be bringing us back something sometime, won't you?
Absolutely.
That's a mandate, no?
Yes, absolutely.
I'm kidding you. Down on the bottom of that, student, staff, and parent data. That's the only place where I saw parent data and the discussion, whether there's working with a student and that kind of thing or whatever.
I think we're going to have a couple of pieces of that. One is our safe and civil data.
Right.
The other is the listening sessions that Dr. Thompson is having us do, where there's going to be some discussion around, she corrects me all the time, so we hope to glean some real-time information from the community as we do those listening sessions.
Okay. I'm not going to go on and on. I could, but I can read this all night long. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I know you all have had many things you've been trying to get done, and it's more and more and more. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation.